His stars were dying. One by one, they faded, their light collapsing into silence. In the void, their deaths passed without song or witness, save for the handful of souls who still looked upward for meaning. From the surface of Cadaverous Secundus, a pale world with a sky veined in crimson cloud, the sun bled dimly through a haze of ancient dust. Its rays were weak, its heat less than a whisper. The horizon was the color of old parchment, cracked and frayed, as if reality itself had begun to peel away. It was here, upon a crumbling balcony of obsidian, that Lorgar Aurelian stood in silent contemplation. His golden armor reflected the wan light, dulled by the dust that drifted in ceaseless tides from the planet's withered mountains. His eyes, the color of deep ochre, were fixed on the dying sun, as though it might answer the questions that had burned within him for decades. Faith, in its purest form, was supposed to bring clarity, but clarity had long fled from Lorgar's heart. He had come to Cadaverous Secundus, not for conquest, nor for strategy, but for a sermon, not one to be spoken aloud, but one written in the vast script of the galaxy itself. This place and its fading star was a mirror of what he felt, the last flicker of belief in an age of cold, consuming doubt. Before I continue, you who watch and listen, you are why this tale lives. We tell it not as empty echo, but because we truly love and care for those who would share in the telling. Before we begin the story proper, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take a moment, settle into your seat, perhaps with a coffee in hand, and let us walk together into this night. Lorgar drew a slow breath, letting the metallic tang of the air fill his lungs. Behind him, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint murmur of 1,000 voices. They were not mortal tongues. They spoke in chords of thought and shadow, words only he could hear. They had been with him for years now, a quiet presence in the corners of his mind, promising truth where the Emperor had delivered only doctrine. The Emperor. Even thinking the name was enough to stir the storm within him. Once he had loved him. Once the sight of that radiant, immortal being had filled him with purpose so vast it had felt eternal. And yet, eternity had a way of rotting from within. He closed his eyes and remembered the first time he had stood in the master of mankind's presence. The golden light had blinded him, not merely with brilliance, but with conviction. The Emperor had spoken of a galaxy united not by superstition, but by truth, a truth of mortal reason, free of gods and the chains of faith. Lorgar had accepted those words as divine in themselves, believing that the Emperor was the truth. But truth, he had learned, could be a cruel deceiver. The wind carried the sound of footsteps, deliberate, armored, familiar. Cor Farron, his oldest companion, knelt at his side. "My lord," Cor said, his voice low, "the fleet awaits your word. Shall we move on the next world?" Lorgar did not answer at once. His gaze still lingered on the dim star, watching the slow ebb of its final light. "Tell me, old friend," Lorgar murmured at last, "when a star dies, does it weep for the worlds it leaves behind?" Cor Farron tilted his head, studying the primarch with careful eyes. "A star knows nothing of love or sorrow. It dies as it was born, blind to the life that depends upon it. And yet," Lorgar said softly, "I cannot look upon this one without pity." The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the slow rasp of the wind over the obsidian stones. Cor Farron, who knew Lorgar better than any, understood what was being asked without the words themselves. "You see in it the Emperor," he said. Lorgar's lips curled in a humorless smile. "Perhaps, or perhaps I see myself." Beneath them, the city of Cadaverus Secundus lay in ruins. Once, its spires had reached upward, like the fingers of supplicants, carved from black glass to catch the light of the star. Now they were broken teeth, jagged against the horizon, their edges glowing faintly in the weak sunlight. The people, what few remained, moved like shades through streets of dust. They no longer prayed, for they had long since stopped believing their prayers were heard. This was the work of the Great Crusade. World by world, culture by culture, the Emperor's armies brought enlightenment, and in doing so, stripped away the beliefs that had given those peoples their identity. It was not always by fire and blade. Sometimes it was enough to let their faith wither under the cold light of imperial truth. And Lorgar had been its most zealous servant. Once, he had brought the word-bearers to 100 worlds, building temples not only to the Emperor's glory, but to the divine truth he believed lay within him. He had taught that the Emperor was not merely a ruler, but a god in the flesh. And in return for his devotion, he had been repaid with humiliation beyond imagining. Monarchia, his perfect city, razed to the ground by order of the very being he had worshipped. The wound had never healed, it had only deepened until it became the core of who he was. Cor Pharaon rose from his kneel. The fleet grows restless, my lord. There are other worlds to be brought into compliance. Shall I give the order? Lorgar turned away from the star at last, his expression unreadable. Yes, tell them we depart at first light. Cor bowed, then strode away, his armor whispering against the stone. Lorgar remained alone, gazing once more at the sun. Its light was weaker now, barely strong enough to pierce the clouds. He thought of the billions of lives that would be extinguished when it finally collapsed. What god, he wondered, would they turn to in those final moments? And in that question, a thought took root. If the Emperor refused divinity, then perhaps divinity must come from elsewhere. He stood in the wind until the horizon turned the color of old blood, until the sun's last rays bled away into the black. And in the silence that followed, the voices in his mind grew clearer, their promises sharper. They spoke of power beyond the Emperor's sight, of truths older than the stars, of gods who would never turn away from worship. For the first time in decades, Lorgar felt not doubt, but purpose. The Great Crusade would continue, the Imperium would grow, but not in the Emperor's image. No, in the image of gods yet unseen. The stars were scattered like cold embers across the void, and the fleet of the 17th Legion drifted among them in perfect, reverent formation. The warships of the word-bearers did not travel as other fleets did. Their prows were carved with scripture, their hulls adorned with prayer sigils etched in adamantium. Even in the silence of space, the ships seemed to whisper, vox chants resonating faintly through the void, like the murmurs of an endless congregation. Aboard the Inafidus Imperator, Lorgar Aurelian walked the length of the Hall of Devotion. The chamber was vast enough to house an imperial frigate, its vaulted ceilings studded with stasis lamps that glowed like distant constellations. Pillars of obsidian and gold rose in solemn ranks, each one carved with passages from the Book of Lorgar, his great and secret work still in progress. He had written none of these words openly. Officially, they did not exist. But here, aboard his flagship, they adorned every surface like sacred fire. The hall was empty, save for one figure. Erebus knelt at the far end, head bowed in private devotion. The first chaplain's armor was black as midnight, his crozius resting across his knees like a penitent's staff. "You pray," Lorgar observed as he approached, his voice low but carrying. "I reflect," Erebus answered without looking up. His voice was calm, measured. the tone of a man who weighed every word before giving it form, on the nature of truth and on the silence of the Emperor. That word, silence, clung to Lorgar's mind like frost. For months now, the Emperor had not spoken to him directly. Orders came through intermediaries, terse and clinical, never warm, never acknowledging the service Lorgar had given. It was as though he had turned his face away. "Does the Emperor's silence trouble you?" Erebus asked, lifting his head at last. His eyes were as sharp as flint, but they carried no accusation, only invitation. Lorgar considered before answering. "Silence is dangerous. Men will fill it with their own truths, and once they do, it is no longer his will that guides them. Or perhaps," Erebus said softly, "it is another's." The words were a drop of oil upon water, subtle, spreading, difficult to see but impossible to remove. They walked together down the length of the hall. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oils, the flicker of votive flames reflecting off the golden script. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled past, their slow dance marking the fleet's passage toward another compliance world. "You have always believed in something greater," Erebus continued. "Even before Monarchia, even before the Crusade, you sought truth in the infinite, and you found it in the Emperor. But what if the Emperor is not the infinite? What if he is only a part of it?" Lorgar stopped, his hand resting lightly upon a pillar carved with the words, "Faith is the lens through which truth is seen." "You speak as though there is another path," Lorgar said. "There is," Erebus replied, "one that does not end in silence, one that answers when you call." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the ship's engines, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. "Have you heard them, my lord?" Erebus asked at last. "Heard who?" "The voices in the silence." The question settled into Lorgar's mind with unsettling familiarity. In the quiet hours, he had indeed heard whispers, faint impressions, visions at the edge of thought. They spoke not in the cold logic of the Emperor's edicts, but in language that was alive, seductive, comforting. "I have heard something," Lorgar admitted, though the words tasted of guilt. "They are not phantoms," Erebus said. "They are truth calling to you across the void. You have the gift to hear them. Few do." Lorgar said nothing, but his eyes drifted to the viewport once more. Outside, a nebula swelled into view, its clouds lit from within by the slow pulse of a dying star. In the heart of its shifting colors, he almost thought he saw shapes, vast robed figures of impossible scale, watching. They moved on in silence, their footsteps echoing in the empty hall. When they reached the archway leading to the strategium, Erebus bowed and stepped aside. "In time, my lord, you will listen more closely, and when you do, you will not be alone." Lorgar passed through without reply, but the words lingered. The next world on their path was Belus Corona, a desert moon with cities of white stone and towering glass spires. The people were devout, but not in the manner the Imperium allowed. Their gods were ancient, carved into monoliths that rose from the desert like the bones of titans. By imperial law, these idols would be shattered, their temples burned, their faith replaced by the Emperor's truth. The compliance was swift. Word-bearers in crimson and gold descended upon the capital, their bolters thundering not as tools of slaughter, but as instruments of order. Resistance crumbled within hours, yet Lorgar did not order the destruction of the monoliths. Instead, he stood before them for an entire day, studying the worn stone, running his fingers over the grooves of alien script. The local priests were brought before him, trembling but defiant, "What do you see in these stones?" Lorgar asked them. "The faces of our gods," the eldest priest replied, his voice hoarse. "They have watched over us since the first dawn." "And when you call to them," Lorgar asked, "do they answer?" The priest's eyes burned with conviction. "Always." The words struck deeper than Lorgar expected. He thought of Erebus's question. "Have you heard them, my lord?" When the compliance was complete, the idols were not destroyed. Officially, they had been catalogued for cultural study. Unofficially, they remained standing, untouched. In the nights that followed, Lorgar walked among them alone, and in the wind that whispered through the desert stones, he thought he heard voices. Days later, aboard the Infidus Imperator, Cor Farron approached him in the Strategium. "The compliance report is incomplete," the old warrior said. "The Ecclesiarchy's representatives will notice the omissions." Lorgar did not look up from the star map. "Let them notice. Let them ask. And when they do, I will tell them that faith cannot be reforged in a day. A world must be guided, not broken." Cor studied him for a long moment. "You are changing, my lord." "Perhaps," Lorgar said. His eyes traced the curling patterns of the warp roots on the hololith. In their swirling lines, he imagined he saw a hand, vast, unseen, reaching for the heart of the Imperium itself. That night, the voices came more clearly. He lay in his private sanctum, armored still, the dim light of the shrine casting his features in gold and shadow. The voices were not loud, but they were present, wrapping around his thoughts like a prayer chant without beginning or end. "You seek truth." "Yes," he whispered. "You seek purpose." "Yes." "Then follow, and you will be shown." When he asked who they were, they did not answer in names. They answered in feelings, in visions of power, in the warmth of eternal presence, in the intoxicating certainty that he was chosen. And in that certainty, sleep came at last. The sky above Monarchia was perfect, a flawless dome of soft blue, stretched from horizon to horizon, brushed by clouds white as marble dust. The air was warm with the breath of summer, scented faintly with incense drifting from the grand plazas. Bells rang in measured cadence from the cathedral towers, their tones resonating like the heartbeat of the city itself. It was a city born of devotion, not merely to the Imperium, but to the Emperor himself. Every avenue was aligned to face the grand basilica. Every wall, arch, and spire was engraved with scripture and hymn, carved so deep into the stone that not even the passage of millennia would erase them. For Lorgar Aurelian, it was the culmination of everything he believed the Great Crusade could be. Not just conquest, but enlightenment. Not just unity, but worship. Monarchia was a living testament that the emperor could be a more than a ruler, that he was worthy of godhood. The citizens walked the streets in joy, their faith woven into every act, every breath. Pilgrims came from far worlds to kneel on its marble steps, and the 17th Legion stood guard over it like crimson angels, their presence both protective and sacred. Lorgar stood at the balcony of the basilica's highest tower, gazing down at his creation. In his heart was the pride of a father watching a child take their first steps. Behind him, Cor Farron approached, his heavy footfalls muffled on the carpet of woven silks. "My lord," Cor said, "the astropaths report that a fleet approaches. Markings of the 13th Legion." Lorgar turned, one brow raised. "The Ultramarines?" "Without notice." "They carry the Emperor's sigil," Cor said, his voice careful. Lorgar's frown deepened. The 13th Legion, under Robert Guilliman, was known for its order and discipline. They did not come unannounced without cause. Summon Erebus. Prepare a formal welcome. Of the welcome never came. The fleet did not slow. It descended upon Monarchia like a steel storm, drop pods and gunships roaring through the clear skies. The first explosions tore the heart out of the eastern district before the city even understood it was under attack. Lorgar's voice roared over the Voxnet, commanding his legion to hold their ground. But the order to resist never came. A single, overriding command was broadcast on a priority channel, encoded with the Emperor's personal authority. Stand down. Do not engage. The word-bearers obeyed, though their hearts burned. And so, they stood in silence, weapons idle, as Guilliman's ultramarines swept through the city with precision. They planted melter charges at the base of spires that had taken decades to raise. They brought down cathedral domes with thunderous detonations that shook the earth. Incense turned to smoke and ash. Scripture that had been carved in devotion was ground beneath ceramite boots. The citizens cried out in confusion and terror. Some clung to statues of the emperor, begging for deliverance, only to be torn away by the blue-armored giants and herded into holding camps. From the tower, Lorgar watched it all. He felt as though his chest had been hollowed out. His legion stood as still as statues around him, their armor gleaming in the light of burning buildings. When the last tower fell, the fleet's flagship descended through the clouds. From it came the Emperor himself. The plaza was silent as he approached. The Ultramarines stood in perfect formation, their armor unmarked by hesitation. The word-bearers knelt as one, their heads bowed, save for Lorgar, who remained standing at the foot of the steps. The Emperor's gaze was a blade. "You have disobeyed me, Lorgar." Lorgar's voice was steady, though it cost him to keep it so. "I have served you with all that I am. I have brought worlds into your light, not with fire and blood, but with faith. Monarchia is the proof of what the Imperium can be." The Emperor's expression did not change. "You have wasted time in idolatry. You have fostered superstition where I commanded truth. I am no god, Lorgar. I will not be worshipped." The words were heavier than any hammer blow. Around them, the air seemed to thin. Even the fires burning in the distance seemed muted. "I gave them hope," Lorgar said. His voice cracked just barely. "I gave them something greater than themselves. You would take that away?" "I will give them truth," the Emperor said. "And truth does not require your temples or your sermons. It requires obedience." Lorgar's hands clenched at his sides. He felt the eyes of his legion upon him, felt their anger, their confusion, but the weight of the Emperor's will pressed down like a mountain, unyielding. The destruction was absolute. By the end of the day, Monarchia was nothing but rubble and smoke. Not one spire stood, not one wall bore the scripture that had once covered the city. The citizens were relocated, their faith declared false and abolished. The word-bearers were gathered in the plaza, kneeling in ranks as the Emperor walked among them. He gave no speech of comfort, no acknowledgement of their service. His words were command, nothing more. "You will spread the imperial truth as I have decreed. No gods, no worship, no faith, save in reason. Disobey again, and I will unmake you." With that, he turned and left. That night, in the shadow of the ruins, Lorgar sat alone. The air was thick with the scent of ash. Every breath tasted of burnt stone and the memory of incense. The voices he had heard in the silence before now came clearer, their tones rich with both pity and promise. "He casts you aside." "Yes," Lorgar whispered. "He does not understand the faith you offer." "No, but there are those who would." The words wrapped around him like a cloak. They were warm where the emperor had been cold, certain where he had been dismissive. Erebus came to stand beside him. "You see now, my lord," the chaplain said softly. "He will never accept what you offer. But there are others, ancient powers, greater than he, who will not turn away from worship." Lorgar looked at the burning horizon, his eyes reflecting the flames. Something inside him shifted. Not the quick strike of rage, but the slow, tectonic movement of conviction changing course. The Emperor had commanded him to abandon faith. Lorgardus, the warp, was never silent. Even in moments of stillness, when the immaterium seemed as calm as an ancient lake beneath a starlit sky, there was always the faint echo of a distant scream, the ghost of a thought that did not belong to you. Lorgar knew this better than most. For weeks now, his fleet drifted through the void on the edge of real space and madness, their course hidden from the eyes of the Emperor's loyal servants. The vessels were cloaked in shadow and prayer. Rituals of concealment whispered by the word-bearers darkened chaplains. The warp currents they rode were not natural. They were guided. Something vast and unseen tugged at their path, like the tide pulling ships toward a shore they could not yet see. Lorgar stood alone in the strategium, his amber eyes closed, his lips moving in soundless invocation. Before him floated a holographic star map, its light dimmed, its projections shifting under the unseen interference of the warp. He could feel the presence again, not merely watching, but calling. It had begun subtly in the days after Kalth's burning. At first it was only in his dreams, a voice like molten gold, dripping with sweetness and venom. But in recent weeks, the voice had grown stronger, intruding into his waking hours, bending the edges of his thoughts. "Beloved son," it whispered now, curling through his mind like incense smoke. "The path is set. You need only take the final step." Lorgar's eyes opened, the warm glow in them dimming with suspicion. "I have taken every step you required," he murmured aloud, his voice low. "The word has been spread. The Imperium cracks. What more do you demand?" The voice chuckled, the sound both maternal and predatory. "You seek to raise an empire of faith, yet faith must be sealed with blood. You have shed much, but not enough. Not the right blood." Elsewhere, aboard the Infidus Imperator, Captain Zafan strode down a cathedral-like corridor toward the strategium. Every bulkhead was carved with scripture, not in high Gothic, but in the curling, blasphemous script of the Book of Lorgar. Gold filigree shone faintly under crimson lumen light, and here and there, servo skulls hovered, reciting fragments of prophecy. The crew had changed since the heresy began. Mortal serfs now wore robes of deep scarlet, their eyes glazed from constant exposure to whispered catechisms. Many bore small brands over their hearts, the stylized eight-pointed star of a god not yet openly named. When Zafan entered, he found Lorgar still before the warp map, but the primarch's expression had shifted. His brow was furrowed, his breathing slow and measured. "My lord," Zafan began, bowing slightly, "scouts report that our course will bring us near the Seraphis cluster. Loyalist supply lines run there, lightly defended. We could—" "No." Lorgar's interruption was soft but final. Zafan straightened, frowning. "No, my lord. Our path is not ours to alter," Lorgar said, turning toward him. His tone was not one of explanation, but of decree. "The hand that guides us has purpose. We will not break from it." Zafan hesitated. He had heard the rumors, the hand that guides us, the unseen will that even the Primarch now seemed to obey. Some of the officers whispered that Lorgar communed with one of the dark gods directly. Others feared it was something is worse. Before he could speak, the vox in the strategium crackled. The voice of Erebus, dark apostle of the 17th Legion, slithered through. My primarch, the preparations are complete. The ritual can begin at your command. Lorgar's eyes gleamed. Then let it begin. The ritual chamber was deep within the Infidus Imperator, far from the mortal crew. The air was heavy with incense, thick enough to choke. Candles burned in spirals upon the floor, their flames bending as though in a constant wind. The walls were covered in scripture, not written with ink, but carved into flesh. Flayed skins, stretched taut, bore the verses of the dark gospel. In the center, a great iron circle was engraved into the deck plating, filled with offerings, bones of loyalists taken from Istvan, the skull of a dead remembrancer, and vials of blood from Lorgar himself. Erebus knelt at the edge of the circle, his voice low and steady as he chanted in the dark tongue. His words did not echo in the chamber, but instead seemed to sink into the air, absorbed like rain into dry earth. The primarch stepped forward. As he entered the circle, the warp surged. The shadows in the chamber seemed to recoil, then slither forward again, wrapping around the participants. Candles guttered, their flames taking on unnatural shapes. Some like reaching hands, others like screaming faces. Then came the voice. Not in Lorgar's mind this time, but aloud, filling every ear in the chamber. My prophet, it purred. Kneel. And Lorgar, the 17th son of the Emperor, knelt. What followed was not a vision in the mortal sense. It was as if reality itself peeled away, and Lorgar stood in a place both infinite and impossibly close. A plane of black glass stretched into forever, beneath a sky of shifting colors. Great shapes moved in the distance, things with too many wings, too many eyes, too many mouths. And before him, something descended. It wore the suggestion of a woman, draped in flowing robes of shadow and fire, her face veiled, her hands outstretched. But where her feet should have touched the ground, the glass cracked and bled molten gold. Do you know me? She asked. Lorgar bowed his head. You are the truth I sought, before I ever knew the lie of the Emperor. Good. The figure moved closer, her presence pressing against his mind like the weight of an ocean. Then hear my command. On the world to which I send you, there is one who bears my mark unknowingly. His death will open the gate. His blood will bind the word to the warp. Lorgar frowned. And if I refuse? The veiled figure leaned down, so close that her voice became a whisper in his ear. Then the galaxy will burn without you, little son, and when it does, your name will be forgotten. When Lorgar awoke from the trance, the candles had gone out. Only Erebus remained, his expression unreadable. My lord, the dark apostle, said softly. What did she say? Lorgar turned toward him slowly. She gave us a name and a world. Erebus smiled faintly. Then the word will be made flesh. And somewhere, deep in the warp, the veiled figure's laughter followed them into the dark. Dead in that moment, to find gods who would never ask such a thing. The warp was never silent. Even in moments of apparent calm, it seethed, an endless, boiling ocean of thought and emotion, of formless nightmares and half-heard voices. For those unshielded, it was a place where sanity unraveled like frayed parchment, where the mind could be stripped bare and rewritten by things older than stars. Lorgar Aurelian sat alone in the Infidus Imperator's sanctum, its chamber walls decorated not with the imperial laurels of his brothers, but with curling runes and holy scripture. The dim lumen glow traced the lines of his face, a mixture of serenity and strain. His hands rested upon an open tome bound in human skin, the script within shifting subtly when one wasn't looking directly at it. "Do you hear them, Corferan?" Lorgar's voice was low, almost reverent. His adoptive father stepped forward from the shadows, his armor painted in the deep bronze of Colchis, but tarnished with age. "I hear, more than I did before. They speak more clearly now." His lip curled in something between a smile and a grimace. "They call you their chosen." Lorgar closed his eyes. In the darkness of his mind, the voices were unmistakable. Thousands, perhaps millions, whispering in perfect harmony. They spoke of destiny, of empires unshackled by the chains of the Emperor's creed. They promised knowledge, power, eternity. "Does it not strike you as strange," Lorgar asked softly, "that they speak with one voice, yet wear many names?" Corferan tilted his head. "Perhaps they are as the Lectitio Divinitatus speaks, a singular divine force manifesting in many aspects." His tone was sharp. "Or perhaps they are truth itself, shattered into prisms by mortal perception." The primarch rose from his seat. His eyes burned faintly in the dimness, as though the warp's light reflected there. "If this is truth, then we have been living in a lie." Weeks earlier, the Ultramarines had departed after the censure. Guilliman's words still echoed in Lorgar's memory, each syllable like a blade in his ribs. "You will kneel to the Emperor's will, or be broken." Since then, Lorgar had not once spoken the Emperor's name aloud. He spoke instead of the great powers, the eternal patrons of mankind's hidden potential. His sermons, though conducted in secrecy, grew in fervor and following. The Infidus Imperator now sailed far from imperial space, its course set for the uncharted edges of the galaxy. The fleet was not idle. It was searching. The Primarch sought worlds where ancient shrines stood untouched by imperial decree, where the warp bled freely into reality. It was on the third such world that the first true contact occurred. The planet was a graveyard. Great spires of black stone jutted from the dust, carved in geometries that hurt the eyes. No wind stirred here. No life dared trespass. As the word-bearer's landing party advanced through the ruins, the air thickened. Vox channels crackled with strange static that sounded almost like breathing. "Lord," murmured Captain Zoromus, gesturing to an archway ahead. "Something stirs within." They entered, bolt guns at the ready. The chamber beyond was vast and circular, its floor inlaid with a great mosaic, a wheel of symbols, each one alien and yet eerily familiar. At the center knelt a figure of pure shadow, its form shifting like smoke. The shadow lifted its head. Its voice was not a voice, but 1,000 voices, some screaming, some weeping, some laughing with manic delight. "We have waited for you, son of Colchis." Lorgar did not flinch. "Then speak. Tell me why." "Because you will make the galaxy burn, and in the ashes, truth will be revealed." Around them, the mosaic began to glow, each symbol flaring with a different hue. A wave of heat passed through the chamber, and suddenly Lorgar understood. The symbols were not meaningless. They were names, names of the powers, names of the warp's gods. He fell to one knee, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Later, aboard the flagship, Lorgar locked himself within the sanctum for 3 days. No mortal saw him eat or rest. When he emerged, his eyes were bright with something new, conviction sharper than any blade. He summoned the Mournival of his legion. Corferan stood at his right, Erebus at his left, their armor gleaming as if freshly anointed. "My brothers," Lorgar began, his voice resonating through the chamber. I have seen the falsity of our path. The Emperor seeks to blind mankind to the greater truths of existence. He would make us servants of a cold, dead ideal, when we could be princes of eternity. Erebus smiled faintly, though his gaze was fixed on the floor. And what truth do you offer in its place, my lord? Lorgar spread his arms. That we are not alone, that there are powers who would see us ascend, not as slaves, but as chosen. They are the true gods, and they have spoken to me. We will be their messengers. Some among the gathering shifted uneasily. Others nodded with slow, deliberate certainty. Corferan's voice was a low growl. Then we begin the great work. From that moment, the word-bearers were changed. Their prayers grew bolder, their rituals more elaborate. Warp breaches were no longer feared, but welcomed. Demonic manifestations were met not with bolter fire, but with kneeling reverence. Yet the warp was not a place of unbroken blessings. Some who reached too far were consumed, their minds torn apart. Others vanished entirely, their armor found days later, empty and cold. To Lorgar, these were sacrifices, necessary costs on the road to truth. The Emperor's light had been a beacon once, but now it seemed to him a cage. In the dark beyond, the warp's radiance blazed with infinite promise. And in that dark, something vast watched him with hunger. The scorched surface of Istvan Vivifi was silent now, save for the wind that curled between jagged ridges of broken ferrocrete and the skeletal frames of shattered war engines. The air was heavy with the tang of blood and the acrid taste of burnt promethium, but beneath this apparent stillness, treachery moved like a serpent through the ranks of the legions. Far above, the skies were streaked with the contrails of retreating thunderhawks, their gunmetal hulls glinting briefly in the dying light. Some bore the markings of loyalist forces, others those of the War Master, but here, on the ash-choked plains, banners no longer meant certainty. Allegiance was shifting, whispered in dark corners, and sealed with the quiet exchange of knowing glances. Lorgar Aurelian stood at the edge of a blasted rise, his bronze armor catching the pale glare of a fading sun. His crozius was planted into the ground beside him, a weapon resting like a pilgrim's staff. He did not look to the battlefield below, but to the horizon, as if searching for some unseen truth in the furnace haze. "You see it now," said Corferan, stepping up beside him. His voice was low, heavy with grim satisfaction. The Emperor's chosen falter. His so-called sons bleed for nothing. The truth begins to spread. Lorgar's lips curled faintly, though not into joy. The truth was always here, old friend. It merely needed fire to make it seen. But there was unease beneath his words. For all his faith in the vision granted to him by darker powers, the cost was mounting. Even the word-bearers, his own legion, had begun to fracture in subtle ways. Some still clung to the old oaths sworn to the Emperor, while others whispered the eightfold path in the dark, eager to cast off the last remnants of imperial creed. Further below, on the wreck-strewn flats, squads of word-bearers and iron warriors moved in uneasy tandem, scavenging ammunition from the fallen. There was no camaraderie, only cold necessity. Warsmith Forix watched the word-bearers with open suspicion, his iron-grey eyes narrowing whenever one of Lorgar's chaplains murmured their half-heard prayers over the dead. It was then that Erebus appeared, as if drawn from the very smoke, his armor marked with fresh scrapes from close combat. In his hands, he carried something swathed in black cloth. He knelt before Lorgar, lowering his head in a gesture that was more performance than humility. "My lord," Erebus said, his voice dripping with false reverence. "The relic is recovered, as you commanded." Lorgar's gaze sharpened. "Show me." The cloth fell away to reveal a jagged fragment of obsidian black stone, its surface etched with faint, twisting runes that seemed to shimmer even in the dimming light. It pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the air around it felt subtly colder. Corferin inhaled sharply. The Covenant Stone. Erebus smiled without warmth. A shard from the deep vaults of Monarchia, preserved before its ruin. It will serve us well in the rites to come. For a moment, Lorgar felt a flicker of something. Nostalgia, perhaps, for the city the Emperor had burned to ash in his great purge of faith. But then the flicker hardened into purpose. Monarchia had died so that the word-bearers might be reborn. This relic would be a blade in the soul of the Imperium. "Prepare the sanctum," Lorgar said at last. "We begin the first invocations at nightfall." Erebus bowed and departed swiftly, the black shard cradled like a newborn. Corferin lingered, watching his primarch with the wary devotion of a zealot who fears his god may yet walk away from him. "You doubt, even now," Corferin murmured. "I question," Lorgar corrected. "Doubt is weakness. Questions are the foundation of truth." But as the last light bled away over Istvan's ruins, Lorgar could not help but wonder, was this path truly his? Or had it been carved for him long before he understood its shape? Night came quickly, bringing with it the low, distant rumble of artillery from far-off engagements. In the shattered cathedral they had claimed as a makeshift shrine, the word-bearers gathered in a circle, their armor lit red by the glow of burning censers. The Covenant Stone was set upon a dais of cracked marble, its runes now shining with an inner light that pulsed in time with the chanting of the assembled chaplains. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls leaned inward to listen. Shapes moved in the shadows beyond the ring of light, shapes too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at impossible angles. The veil between worlds was thinning, and through it something watched. Lorgar stepped forward, raising his Crozius high. His voice rolled like distant thunder. "We stand upon the bones of empires. The Imperium would have you believe this is the end, but it is only the beginning. Cast aside the false light. Embrace the truth written in the darkness." The chanting rose to a fever pitch. The Covenant Stone shone brighter, its runes twisting, changing. A low hum built in the air, becoming a scream, not of fear, but of rapture. Corferin's eyes were wide with awe. Foryx, watching from the edge of the gathering, felt a knot tighten in his gut. Whatever was happening here was no simple ritual. It was a summoning. And then, as the final syllable of the invocation echoed into silence, the Covenant Stone split with a sound like shattering glass. From within spilled a shadow that coiled and writhed, forming vague outlines of wings and claws, before dispersing into the air. Lorgar stood unmoved, his expression unreadable. "It begins," he said softly. "The night of the Emperor's reign has come." Far above, the stars burned cold and distant, their light indifferent to the wars of men and gods alike. Yet in that ruined cathedral, a new power had taken root, and its seeds would one day grow into the death of worlds. The shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to linger longer now, and the whispers, once faint, were growing bolder. Those who heard them found their thoughts shifting, their loyalties bending. The treachery that had begun in secret now spread like a sickness, slow but unstoppable. For in the age to come, brother would kill brother, and the galaxy itself would drown in the blood of its champions. The sky above Colchis was a swirling bruise of crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves bled in anticipation of what was to come. The wind carried with it the bitter scent of ash and the metallic tang of storms. Upon the blackened plateau outside Varadesh, Lorgar stood alone, though the eyes of gods were upon him. For days he had fasted. For nights he had wandered the shifting sands in visions. He had sought the voices that had whispered to him in the Great Crusade's quiet moments, the ones the Emperor had warned him never to heed. Now he called them forth openly. He was done hiding his yearning, done kneeling to the false restraint of his father. The first sign came as a rumble deep beneath the rock, a slow pulse like the heartbeat of the world. Then came the wind, spiraling in unnatural patterns, stinging Lorgar's skin as if each grain of dust carried intent. A shadow formed at the horizon, vast, winged, and without form, until it resolved into a tapestry of shifting faces. They spoke in unison, the words curling into his mind rather than touching the air. You have called. We have answered. Lorgar's chest rose and fell slowly. I have walked the path you set before me. I have seen the lies that bind humanity. The Emperor, my father, would have us worship nothing but his hollow truth. I reject him. I seek the truth you offer. The entity's shape shifted, now becoming a great horned beast of fire, then a golden woman whose eyes were endless voids. Truth is not given, son of Colchis. It is bargained. Will you give what is required? He did not hesitate. I will give all. From the darkness between stars, others gathered. A robed giant with feathered wings whose every movement shed stardust. A serpent made of black water, its coils the length of continents. A burning knight who wore a crown of screaming skulls. Lorgar felt their hunger, not for his flesh, but for his faith, his certainty, his will. They circled him, speaking in turn. Will you bind your sons to our cause, that their strength be ours? Will you seed the galaxy with our name, that the stars themselves speak it in fear and devotion? Will you spill the blood of those you once swore to protect if they stand against us? Lorgar's voice did not waver. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The ground split beneath him, a fissure glowing with molten light. Out of it rose a black monolith etched with runes that seemed older than creation itself. Upon its surface were names, countless and unknowable. The gods bade him place his hand upon it. When he did, agony, unlike any battle wound, pierced through him. Visions flooded his mind, entire civilizations kneeling in worship, worlds burning in sacrifice, his own brothers falling one by one in ruin and glory. He saw himself crowned not as a servant, but as a prophet king of the pantheon. Blood trickled from his nose, his eyes, his mouth. He did not remove his hand. When it was done, the plateau was silent again, the sky clear as glass. But something inside Lorgar was different. His veins hummed with power. His heart beat in perfect time with the will of the warp. Around his shadow, smaller shadows moved in ways the wind could not explain. Corferin and Erebus appeared at the edge of the rock, their eyes wide in reverence. They had felt it, the shift, the weight of something vast descending into the mortal realm. It is done, Corferin asked, though he already knew. Lorgar turned to them, and for the first time since his rebuke on Monarchia, a true smile crossed his face. It is begun. The days that followed saw quiet preparations aboard the Fidelitas Lex. Word spread among the most devout of the word-bearers that their primarch had been touched by revelation. Rituals grew more elaborate. The legion's iconography shifted subtly, incorporating symbols no imperial heraldry recognized. The Lectitio Divinitatus, once whispered in secret, was now being rewritten in a new form, filled with veiled praises to powers unnamed. Erebus moved like a shadow through the legion, his voice oil-smooth as he planted seeds in every ear. Corfaran began selecting entire companies for pilgrimage duties, removing them from imperial oversight. Lorgar himself spent hours in meditation, but it was no longer the empty worship of the emperor. Now the warp answered him in dreams. He saw the paths of his brothers, their pride, their flaws, the moments where they might be turned. He began to weave the great tapestry of betrayal that would one day engulf the galaxy. On the eve of their next campaign, a final vision came to him. He stood in the ruins of a burning palace. A great spire collapsed at his feet. Upon its broken stones lay the emperor, not dead, but shackled in chains of light, his face obscured in shadow. Around him stood the four, each smiling in triumph. The voice of the Pantheon filled Lorgar's mind once more. "You have taken the first step, beloved son. Now walk the path to its end." And Lorgar, prophet of the true gods, bowed his head, not in servitude, but in promise. That was the night the galaxy's fate was sealed, though none but the gods and their chosen yet knew it. The skies above Colchis were crimson with the light of a dying sun. Once, this world had been the heart of Lorgar's faith, a sacred cradle for the word-bearer's devotion. Now it was a place of mourning. The surface was scarred by bombardments, and the cities had been reduced to twisted ruins. The banners of the Imperium had long been torn down, replaced by the eight-pointed star of the dark gods. Yet for Lorgar, the victory tasted like ash. He stood upon the blackened balcony of a shattered temple, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where smoke drifted lazily into the heavens. Below, his warriors moved in silence, rebuilding fortifications and burying the dead. There was no joy in them. Even the most fervent believers knew that their war had claimed more than it had given. Corfaran, ever watchful, approached from behind. "You brood, my lord," he said softly, as though speaking to a wounded beast. "I reflect," Lorgar replied, his voice low. "There is a difference." Corfaran's gaze swept over the ruined streets. "We have won, Lorgar. The Imperium's grip on this world is broken. Our faith reigns supreme." "And yet," Lorgar said, his tone bitter, "I cannot shake the memory of the brothers who once stood beside us, those who now curse my name." His mind wandered to Guilliman, to the days before the heresy, when they had stood together beneath the Emperor's banner. To Fulgrim, who had laughed and shared wine with him in halls now long forgotten. To Horus, whose fall had dragged them all into the abyss. But it was not the memory of primarchs that hurt most. It was the faces of the mortal brothers, the chaplains, the legionaries, the nameless soldiers who had believed in the Emperor as he once had. Men he had convinced to change their faith, only to watch them burn for it. That evening, Lorgar convened his inner circle within the temple's desecrated sanctum. The air smelled of burnt incense and old blood. Candles flickered in the gloom, casting shadows across the carved symbols of chaos etched into the walls. "We stand at the threshold of a new crusade," Corfaran began, his voice oily with zeal. "The dark gods bless us with strength and purpose. It is time to strike at the Imperium's heart." Zardu Layak, the twisted dark apostle, leaned forward. His face was a mask of devotion, yet his eyes glimmered with fanatic madness. "The scriptures speak of a coming storm, my lord. The signs are clear. We must act, lest the moment pass." But Lorgar raised a hand, silencing them. Our strength is not yet whole. We have bled too much. Too many brothers lie beneath the soil. The Imperium is vast, and though we have the favor of the gods, the enemy still commands legions of their own. Cor Phaeron frowned. You would have us wait. The gods will not wait forever. They will, Lorgar said with quiet certainty, for they have no need of time as we do. But my brothers, my sons, they are mortal in flesh, even if their souls are claimed. They must be ready, not merely armed, but unbreakable in will. After the council dispersed, Lorgar wandered the streets of the ruined city. He passed makeshift shrines where warriors knelt in prayer. He passed orphaned children playing among shattered statues of the emperor, their laughter unnerving in its innocence. He passed the charred remains of imperial churches, their spires broken and bent like the fingers of corpses. He paused before a collapsed chapel. The stonework was scorched, the stained glass reduced to jagged fragments. Yet in the rubble, half buried, lay a weathered icon of the emperor, its face cracked, but the gaze still stern and unwavering. For a long moment, Lorgar simply stared. Once, he had adored that face. Once, he had thought it the visage of a god. Now, he saw only a mask, one worn by a tyrant who demanded worship, yet denied divinity. But as much as he hated the emperor, a part of him still remembered the love he had felt, and it tore at him. He turned away sharply, his cloak swirling like shadow in the wind. The night brought with it a bitter wind and the whispering voices of the warp. Lorgar lay in his quarters, though sleep eluded him. His mind swam with memories of Monarchia burning, of the Emperor's judgment, of the first time he had heard the voice of chaos. Was it truly choice, he wondered, or was I always bound to this path? In the darkness, he heard footsteps. Zardu-Layak entered without knocking, his eyes bright with unnatural light. My lord, the dark apostle said, I have seen visions. They speak of betrayal yet to come. Lorgar's eyes narrowed. Betrayal from whom? I cannot see the face, only the shadow it casts, a shadow shaped like a brother. The primarch felt a coldness settle over him. In the days of the Great Crusade, he might have dismissed such a warning as superstition. Now, he knew better. The gods spoke in riddles, but their truths were real. Did weeks passed. Colchis began to rebuild, its people reshaped by the word-bearer's faith. But the bond between Lorgar and his legion was not as unshakable as it once had been. The war had forged fanatics, but it had also bred doubt. Whispers reached him, whispers of captains who questioned his restraint, of warriors who believed Cor Phaeron or Zardu-Layak more worthy of leadership. These murmurs did not anger Lorgar. They saddened him. It was the same story, repeated across eternity. Faith gave way to division, and division gave birth to ruin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lorgar stood upon the balcony once more. The crimson light bathed the city in a bloody glow. My brothers are ashes, he murmured to himself, and I am the wind that scatters them. Cor Phaeron appeared beside him. Ashes can be remade into fire, my lord. You need only strike the spark. Perhaps, Lorgar said, but tell me, old friend, when the fire burns again, will it consume the enemy, or will it consume us? Cor Phaeron did not answer. Far above, unseen beyond the mortal sky, the gods watched with silent amusement. The ashes of brotherhood would not remain cold forever. The storm was coming, and in its heart, the word-bearers would burn anew. The cavernous depths beneath the Noctis labyrinth were a place untouched by sunlight for millennia. Here, Beneath the crimson deserts of Mars, the air was heavy with the metallic tang of machine oil and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of ancient engines that had never been allowed to die. This was the Silent Forge, a forbidden sector of the Mechanicus domain, sealed in both oath and secrecy. It was a place where only the most devout, or the most dangerous, of the tech priests were ever permitted to walk. Magos Karazhan's footsteps echoed in the darkness, each a dull clang of steel boots on adamantine floors. He carried no torch. The walls themselves pulsed with faint strips of lumen light embedded into their surface, like veins carrying the lifeblood of some great slumbering god machine. Karazhan was not here for sanctioned work. His crimson robes, heavy with gold cog insignia, hid the fact that his primary Auspex unit was running silent. The forge was forbidden for a reason. Here were kept the remnants of Titan constructs so ancient, even the Omnissiah's true name seemed younger in comparison. At the heart of the forge stood a hulking silhouette, still chained to the walls as if it were a prisoner rather than a relic. Karazhan stepped closer, his augmetic eyes focusing on the intricate curves of the Titan's armor. Its plating was blackened and scorched, bearing wounds that had never healed, and its carapace was marked with symbols no longer found in the archives of Mars. "Machine spirit," Karazhan whispered, his voice almost reverent. "You have been forgotten by the world above, but I have not." He extended a mechadendrite, tipped with a data probe, pressing it into one of the ancient ports hidden beneath the armor. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a spark of crimson light flickered behind the Titan's dead eyes. A voice, low and fractured, growled inside his mind through the new spheric link. "Who wakes? Me?" Karazhan's breath hitched. A servant of the Omnissiah, one who seeks truth in the shadow of falsehood. There was silence, then a rumble like the grinding of stone. "They locked me away, because I would not kneel." A shiver ran through Karazhan's organic spine. He had suspected, but hearing it confirmed sent a thrill of both terror and exhilaration through him. This Titan, this god machine, had defied the will of the Fabricator General himself. "Will you kneel for me?" he asked, the question half jest, half plea. The Titan's voice was sharper now, each syllable dripping with an ancient, predatory cunning. "No, but I will walk beside you, if you free me." Above, in the upper levels of the forge temple, alarms began to wail. They were not loud, not yet, but enough to signal that someone had broken the seals. Karazhan's mechadendrites moved in a blur, disconnecting magnetic locks, severing containment feeds, and overriding machine spirit wards that had been in place since before the Great Crusade. The Titan shuddered, chains clattering to the ground in clouds of rust. The first squad of Skitari arrived just as the Titan's reactor began to purr. They opened fire, galvanic rifles spitting blue streaks of energy through the air. But the shots did not reach their mark. A shimmering barrier of energy flared to life, the Titan's void shields activating for the first time in thousands of years. Karazhan looked up at the towering form and felt something he had not known in centuries. Awe. The Titan's helm tilted downward, its crimson optics locking with his. "Come, priest, let us remind the Red Planet what fear feels like." With a roar that shook the walls, the Titan's engines flared. The silent forge, so long a tomb, became a birthing ground for war once again. And deep within its awakened heart, something older than Mars itself stirred. Something that remembered the taste of betrayal. This was no longer just a god machine. This was a weapon of vengeance. And it had the streets of Olympus Mons were never meant to feel fear. They were forged from sacred ferrocrete, engraved with catechisms to the Omnissiah, and guarded by Skitarii whose faith was etched into their very neural code. Yet as the great titan rose from the bowels of the silent forge, even the machine spirits inhabiting the city's infrastructure seemed to hesitate. Its vast form tore through the gates of the underground vault, each step sending tremors through the Martian crust. Dust rained from the spires above, and Vox relays across the capital city crackled with confused reports. Unidentified Titan-class engine loose in the Noctis sector. Designation not found in any registered archives. Skitarii forces falling back, shields impenetrable. Magos Karazon rode in the shadow of the Titan's colossal feet, his augmented stride swift but insignificant compared to the god machines. The creature, for that was what it had become in his mind, moved with purpose, its optics sweeping across the horizon like a predator scenting prey. Every Mechanicus loyalist within range was mobilizing. Skitarii maniples darted between avenues, positioning heavy weapons and grav cannons along firing lines. Above, the faint glimmer of orbital servitor arrays tracked the Titan, preparing to bring down fire from the sky if ordered. But the Titan, this heretic god, as Karazon had already begun to name it in his thoughts, was not walking blindly. Each turn of its head, each calculated step, told of a mind within that understood the lay of the city as well as any commander. "Where do you march?" Karazon voxed through the noospheric link. The Titan's reply was a rumbling growl across the data stream. "To the throne of the false priest." It took Karazon a moment to realize. The Fabricator General's sanctum lay at the heart of the city's highest spire, the Tower of the Omnissiah. No Titan had walked its causeways in living memory. The first salvo came from a pair of warhound Titans stationed on the city's perimeter. Sleek and predatory, they darted forward, plasma blast guns spitting searing bolts that could have vaporized a Lehman Russ tank in an instant. The air shimmered as the heretic god's void shields flared, absorbing the impacts in waves of burning light. The black-armored Titan answered with contempt. Its apocalypse missile launchers roared, sending a storm of high-yield warheads arcing into the sky before descending in a rain of fire. One warhound was torn apart instantly, its limbs scattering across the Martian desert. The other staggered back, armor plates sloughing away under the onslaught. Civilians, vat-born laborers, robed tech adepts, and servitors alike flooded the streets in panic, not from loyalty to the Fabricator General, but from instinctive terror. Even on Mars, where every life was in service to the machine, there was no protocol for the reappearance of an unregistered Titan of unknown origin. Inside the tower, the Fabricator General's voice cut across the city-wide vox with the force of a commandment. "All forces, contain and destroy the rogue engine. By the will of the Omnissiah, it must be silenced." Karazon smiled under his respirator. He had studied that voice for centuries, each syllable wrapped in ritual, each word shaped like a blade. And now he heard something rare in it: unease. The heretic god pushed onward, undeterred by the growing resistance. Macro cannon emplacements on the spire walls thundered to life, sending shells the size of troop carriers screaming toward the advancing colossus. Most glanced from its shields. Those that did not left only blackened scars on armor, older than the city itself. When the Titan spoke again, it was not through the noospheric channel, but aloud, its voice amplified by god-machine voxcasters that shook windows across the district. "Mars has forgotten who forged it. I have come to remind you." The words were not for Karazon. They were for every soul in the city. By the time the Titan reached the base of the Tower of the Omnissiah, the Mechanicus defenders were in disarray. Legions of Skitarii lay broken, their neural links fried by the Titan's interference fields. Engenzir's cowered in the ruins of their emplacements, their machine spirits refusing to obey. Karazhan stood at the Titan's heel, looking up at the spire that had dominated the skyline since before he was born. Somewhere at its summit, the Fabricator General was preparing his final line of defense. The Titan lowered its head slightly, crimson optics narrowing. "Priest," it said, almost softly, "the gate is yours. The throne is mine." And then it raised one titanic foot and brought it down against the tower's gate with a force that shook Olympus Mons to its roots. The sacred Ferrocrete shattered. The march of the heretic god had reached its end, and the siege of the Fabricator General was about to begin. The battle for Colchis Secundus had ended in a shroud of smoke and whispers. The cities were broken, the skies veiled in the ash of burning temples, and the streets still carried the stench of blood and betrayal. Yet the true war, the war for the soul of Lorgar, was only just beginning. In the aftermath, the surviving warriors of the Word-Bearers gathered in the ruined amphitheatre of Varix, the place where once the Lectitio Divinitatus had been preached to tens of thousands. Now its stone seats were cracked, its pillars scorched black, and its great altar lay toppled in the dust. The faithful had been scattered, their voices silenced, and yet, in the quiet, there was a new kind of devotion taking root. Kor Pharon, the eternal shadow at Lorgar's side, stood apart from the milling warriors. His black eyes roamed the destruction like a predator's, searching for meaning in the chaos. He could feel it. Somewhere beyond the veil of mortal perception, something had taken notice of their devotion, their defiance, their refusal to abandon worship in a galaxy ruled by a silent, uncaring emperor. Lorgar himself knelt before the broken altar. His armor was scorched, his pauldrons still streaked with the blood of the slain, but his gaze was distant, as though fixed on some vision only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, more prayer than command. "The Emperor gave us truth, but not the whole truth. We have been guided not to worship, but to obedience. And yet, faith demands more than obedience. Faith demands a God worthy of devotion." Erebus, ever the serpent, stepped forward. His voice was smooth, coaxing. "My lord, perhaps the truth is that the galaxy has never belonged to one god alone. Perhaps there are powers older than the Emperor, powers that offer more than his cold reason." The words hung heavy in the air. Even among the word-bearers, there were murmurs of unease. Such talk was dangerous, treacherous. But Lorgar did not silence him. Instead, he rose. His golden eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "If there are such powers, Erebus, then we shall find them, and we shall learn if they are worthy of our devotion." In the weeks that followed, the word-bearers began their pilgrimage. Not to Terra, not to the Emperor's courts, but into the forgotten corners of the galaxy where ancient civilizations had withered and died, leaving only fragments of their beliefs. They came to the blackened shrine world of Tharsis, where 1,000 temples lay, buried beneath obsidian sands. There, Lorgar walked barefoot through the ruins, feeling the weight of aeons pressing upon him. In the silence, he began to hear whispers, not from the lips of his followers, but from the very stones themselves. At the temple's heart, they found a mural carved into a wall of unyielding basalt. It depicted not one god, but many, entities vast and strange, surrounded by flame, shadow, and storm. Some were crowned in light, others wreathed in writhing forms, and all seemed to reach out toward the mortals below. Lorgar studied it for hours. When he emerged, there was a change in his bearing, subtle, but undeniable. The Emperor, for all his majesty, was no longer the sole axis of Lorgar's faith. Corferan was the first to notice the change in the sermons. Lorgar still spoke of the Emperor's glory, but now his words were laced with questions. Questions that led his listeners to imagine forces beyond the imperial truth. He began to speak of the great design, of unseen architects shaping the fates of mortals and immortals alike, and the whispers grew louder. In his dreams, Lorgar walked through a vast cathedral whose spires pierced the void itself. The walls were made of screaming faces, and the light that poured through its stained glass was not sunlight, but a shifting spectrum of colors that hurt the eyes and yet entranced the soul. There he saw thrones, 4 of them, each shrouded in veils of power, and from those thrones came the same voices he had heard in the ruins of Tharsis. Erebus nurtured this transformation carefully, feeding Lorgar fragments of forbidden scripture, half-truths wrapped in devotion, until the primarch's heart burned with a need for deeper understanding. One night, aboard the Infidus Imperator, Lorgar summoned his inner circle. Corferan, Erebus, Arguel Toll, and a few chosen captains gathered in the great chapel at the ship's core. The candles burned with an unnatural steadiness, and the shadows seemed to lean toward the altar. Lorgar's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. We have served faithfully. We have obeyed without question. And for our loyalty, the Emperor has given us silence. But there are voices that do answer, powers that see our devotion, that would reward it. I will find them, and I will kneel to the one who is worthy. There was no applause, no cheer, only a deep, reverent silence, the kind of silence that precedes a great and terrible act. The pilgrimage became a quest. The word-bearers sought out dead worlds, warp-tainted relics, and the ruins of civilizations that had never been touched by the Emperor's light. With each step, Lorgar's sermons grew more esoteric, his visions more vivid. On the world of Caden V, they uncovered an ancient vault carved into a mountainside. Within lay a single artifact, a black tome bound in something that might have once been flesh. Its script shifted when one tried to read it, as though the words themselves were alive. Lorgar touched it, and the chapel's braziers guttered and died. The temperature dropped, and for an instant, the warp pressed against reality, like a storm against a window. His warriors drew their weapons, but Lorgar only smiled. This is scripture. That night, Corferan found Lorgar alone in his quarters, staring into nothing. The Primarch's face was pale, his eyes wide, as though he had seen something far greater than mortal comprehension. "They are real, Cor," he whispered. "Not myths, not dreams." God's Corferan asked the question that had been gnawing at him for months. And the Emperor? Lorgar's gaze hardened. He is not their enemy, but neither is he their master. From that moment, the course of the word-bearers was set. They would no longer merely spread the Emperor's truth. They would seek the truth beyond him. And in doing so, they would open the first cracks in the walls of the Imperium's faith. The seeds were sown. The harvest would be ruin. The Chapel of the Covenant stood at the edge of the city, its marble spires cutting into the sky like spears of devotion. Once it had been a place of peace, a sanctuary for those who sought comfort in the divine. Now its walls were heavy with incense, and its doors guarded not by humble priests, but by crimson-armored custodians. Faith had become a weapon, and those who entered did so not to pray, but to swear loyalty. Inside, The light from high stained glass windows spilled across the floor in hues of gold and scarlet. The murals told a story: the ascension of the emperor, the triumph over old night, the smiting of heretics. Yet in one corner, a new image had been painted. It was Lorgar, kneeling in golden light, a halo about his head, holding a book. His face was serene, but his eyes, as painted by the artist, were not of a man in prayer. They were of a man in control. The air was still, save for the sound of low chanting. Lines of robed adepts stood in the pews, reciting the verses from the Lectitio Divinitatus. The words were gentle on the tongue, but heavy on the heart, promising salvation, warning of eternal damnation. The people clung to every syllable, as if their lives depended on them. At the altar, Lorgar himself stood. No longer the humble missionary he had once been, he carried himself as a prophet enthroned in destiny. His voice was low and deliberate, each phrase deliberate enough to carve itself into the minds of his listeners. "We are the chosen of the Emperor," he intoned. "We are the hands that shape his will, the flame that burns his enemies. But faith without obedience is the path of ruin. Obedience without faith is slavery. Together, they are the chains that bind us to the divine purpose." At the far end of the hall, a figure shifted uncomfortably. It was Cor Pharaon. His armor was darker now, adorned with symbols whose origins were older than the Imperium. He leaned against a pillar, his eyes scanning the crowd. The people were enthralled, just as Lorgar had intended. Too much faith in one man, and they will forget the Emperor entirely, Cor Pharaon murmured, just loud enough for Erebus to hear. Erebus, standing beside him, smiled faintly. Perhaps that is the point. The sermon reached its crescendo. Lorgar's words were no longer measured. They burned. The galaxy will not be won by steel alone. It will be won by belief. Belief so strong that even death cannot kill it. Belief so unyielding that it will shatter the thrones of false gods. A cheer erupted from the congregation. Some knelt, others wept, some pressed their foreheads to the floor in devotion. The scene was one of rapture. And in that moment, it was clear that the imperial truth was dead here. In its place, the imperial faith now ruled. Later that night, the chapel lay silent. Lorgar walked the aisles alone, his footsteps echoing. He stopped before the great mural of the Emperor. His gaze lingered on the painted eyes, and for a moment he seemed almost conflicted. "You gave me truth," he whispered, "and I have turned it into worship. Was that your plan, or mine?" Behind him, Erebus approached quietly. "It does not matter, my lord. The plan is no longer in your hands. It is in theirs." He gestured toward the empty pews. Once belief takes root, it grows beyond the gardener's will. Lorgar did not respond at once. His hand brushed the altar. "Then perhaps we are no longer servants. Perhaps we are architects." In the crypt beneath the chapel, the true work was being done. Not prayer, but preparation. Priests and scribes copied the Lectitio by hand, sending copies to distant worlds. Initiates were trained in oratory and doctrine, their voices sharpened into tools of persuasion. Those who resisted the message were corrected. Cor Pharaon moved among them like a shadow. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant reminder that faith here was enforced as much by fear as it was by love. "Word spreads fast," he told Lorgar later. "Already there are whispers in the fleets. Some captains welcome the faith. Others," he shrugged, "others are less willing." "Then we make them willing," Lorgar said simply. His voice had the cold certainty of inevitability. Erebus grinned. "The chains of faith bind the willing and the unwilling alike. The following day, a delegation from the administratum arrived, bearing the emperor's seal. They were stern-faced men in dark robes, their leader a tall figure with thin lips and sharper eyes. "We are here to inspect the compliance of your sermons with the imperial truth," the man announced. His tone was polite, but it carried an unspoken warning. Lorgar welcomed them warmly, leading them into the chapel. The adepts watched from the shadows as the officials examined the murals, the books, the altar. Their questions were careful, their notes more careful still. Finally, the leader spoke. "Your devotion to the Emperor is commendable, Lord Lorgar, but some of your language suggests divinity." Lorgar smiled faintly. "If the Emperor is the pinnacle of human achievement, the guardian of mankind, the one who has delivered us from old night, what word is greater than divine?" The officials exchanged glances. One of them began to speak, but Erebus stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his weapon. "Words have power," he said softly. "Be careful which ones you challenge." The officials left soon after, their faces unreadable. Lorgar watched them go, knowing that their report would carry weight, but not enough to stop him. That night, the congregation returned in greater numbers than before. News of the imperial inspectors had spread, and the people gathered not in fear, but in defiance. They listened as Lorgar spoke of persecution, of the trials faced by the faithful. His voice became a rallying cry. "The Emperor tests us," he declared. "He sends his servants to challenge our belief, to see if it will break. But we will not break. We will endure, as steel endures the hammer. We will shine, as gold shines beneath fire." The cheer that followed was not just worship, it was rebellion in disguise. When dawn broke, the chapel bells rang again, but their tone had changed. They no longer called people to prayer. They summoned them to action. The chains of faith had tightened, and once bound, there was no escape. In the shadows, Cor Farron and Erebus exchanged a glance. What they had built here could not be undone. It was no longer simply Lorgar's vision. It was a movement, vast and unstoppable. And far above, in the distant palace on Terra, the Emperor would soon hear of it. But by then, it would be too late. The flames of the heretics' banners still clung to the skyline like wounds on the horizon. The once proud spires of Colchis' sacred cities lay shattered, their temples blackened, their idols defiled. In the aftermath of the slaughter, Lorgar stood alone upon the ruins, his eyes fixed not on the carnage around him, but on the great work that lay ahead. The voices of the gods whispered through the ashes, a chorus of temptation and promise. They had been patient with him, feeding him visions of glory and eternity, of empires that would stand long after the Emperor's light had faded into dust. But patience had its limits, and the chains they had woven around the primarch's soul were now pulling tight. "I have followed," Lorgar whispered into the smoke, his voice hoarse. "I have given myself over. What more do you demand?" The answer came not in words, but in sensation. A tide of fire ran through his veins, visions exploding across his mind, worlds burning at his command, armies kneeling before him, the galaxy reshaped in the image of his faith. But always, behind the promise of victory, there was a shadow, a cost that could not yet be measured. Erebus approached through the ruins, his dark armor glistening with soot. "The path is set, my lord. The lodestone is prepared. The oaths have been spoken." He dropped to one knee, his voice trembling with both reverence and hunger. The gods are ready to receive you." Lorgar turned to face him, and for a moment, there was the faintest flicker of doubt in the primarch's golden eyes. But then, as if crushed beneath the inevitability of fate, he nodded. "Then we proceed. No more hesitation." The ritual began beneath the broken dome of a desecrated cathedral. The air was thick with incense and blood, the floor covered in a web of runes that seemed to shift when one tried to look directly at them. The first chaplain chanted in a language older than the Imperium, and the legion knelt, their voices joining in the dark litany. As the final syllables echoed into silence, the chains became real. Not of iron or steel, but of raw will, forged by the gods, anchored in the hearts of every Astartes who had sworn fealty to the new faith. Lorgar felt them coil around his spirit, binding him to a destiny from which there could be no turning back. The pain was exquisite. It was not the agony of the body, but the tearing of the soul, the slow, merciless unraveling of all that he had once been. Images of the Emperor's face flickered before him, stern, unyielding, disappointed, before dissolving into the cold laughter of the warp. When the chains were set, he rose. The legion rose with him, no longer warriors of the Emperor, but apostles of the gods. The last vestiges of loyalty to terror had been cut away like rotting flesh, and in its place stood something new, something terrible. Yet even in his triumph, Lorgar felt the weight of those unseen bonds. The gods had not given him freedom. They had given him a leash. And though it was long, it would always be there, coiling tighter with each act of devotion, each drop of blood spilled in their name. The chains of heresy had been forged, and they would never break. The skies above Serenth burned with the light of false dawn, not from the rising of a star, but from the unending fire of orbital bombardment. Cities crumbled under the wrath of the word-bearers, their cathedrals torn apart, not by the neglect of faith, but by the will of gods that demanded new altars. Lorgar stood upon the bridge of the Infidus Imperator, his gaze fixed on the world below. It was the first true crusade in the name of his new faith, and every shell that fell, every shrine that burned, was a sermon in fire. Serenth's people had refused the word, clinging instead to the imperial creed. That defiance had sealed their fate. "Begin the descent," Lorgar commanded, his voice calm, almost reverent. The command rippled through the fleet. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, their hulls igniting in re-entry, descending like falling meteors. When they struck the ground, the faithful poured forth in crimson armor, chanting praises to the gods that had claimed them. Erebus and Cor Pharon led the assault, each a prophet in his own right. Erebus moved with the precision of a man fulfilling prophecy, his every strike deliberate, his every word another nail in the coffin of imperial faith. Cor Pharon, by contrast, was fury incarnate, his voice a roar that broke mortal spirits before the blade ever touched them. The defenders fought with desperate resolve. Regiments of the Imperial Guard, backed by the zeal of local priests, met the word-bearers in the streets. The battle was vicious, the air filled with the scream of lass-fire, the crack of bolters, and the guttural chants of the invaders. Every intersection became a killing ground, every alleyway a grave. Lorgar descended hours later, his Terminator guard forming a living wall around him. He did not draw his weapon. Instead, he walked through the ruins like a preacher among the lost, reciting verses from his own scriptures, verses that seeped into the minds of those who heard them, weakening their will, eroding their faith in the Emperor. When the surviving priests were brought before him, they spat curses in his face, calling him apostate and traitor. Lorgar listened in silence, then knelt before them, not in mockery, but in solemnity. "You serve a God who does not hear you," he said quietly. "I serve gods who speak to me in every breath, in every heartbeat. They will not abandon their children." His words were not a plea, but a verdict. With a nod, the priests were taken to the newly consecrated altar, a slab of Serenth marble, stained red with the blood of the day's offerings. There, the rituals of the dark faith were enacted for the first time on this world. By nightfall, Serenth's capital was silent. The imperial banners were ashes, replaced by symbols of the pantheon. The people who survived the massacre were given a choice: kneel or die. Most knelt. Those who did not were sacrificed. In the days that followed, the transformation of the planet began in earnest. Every church was remade into a temple of the gods. The city squares were given over to public rites, some beautiful in their ceremony, others drenched in horror. The word-bearers moved among the populace not as conquerors, but as missionaries, preaching sermons that fused the promise of salvation with the certainty of domination. The success of Serenth became a beacon to other worlds. The message was clear. The old faith of terror was a dying thing, and the future belonged to those who bent the knee to the new gods. And so the march continued, system to system, sector to sector, a tide of crimson and black sweeping away the Emperor's light. But in the quiet moments, Lorgar felt the pull of the chains he had accepted. Every victory brought him closer to the gods' design, but also deeper into their grasp. His crusade was no longer his own. It was theirs. And though his heart swelled with the fire of belief, a small, silent part of him wondered if he had traded one tyrant for another. The march of the faithful could not be stopped, but neither could the leash that guided it be. The temple was quiet, not with the silence of peace, but with the heavy stillness that comes when the world itself seems to be holding its breath. Serenth had been remade, its streets lined with the banners of the dark pantheon, its people kneeling in worship to gods they could not name a year ago. Yet for Lorgar, the victory tasted of ash. He stood before the altar at the heart of the grand basilica, once the seat of the imperial creed, now transformed into the holiest site of his faith on this world. The towering stained glass windows had been remade, no longer depicting the Emperor's ascension, but the four gods in all their terrible majesty. The colours burned when the light passed through, casting the chamber in hues of blood, shadow, rot, and excess. Erebus entered quietly, his footsteps echoing. "It is done," he said, voice low. "The last resistance pockets have fallen. The people are yours." Lorgar did not look at him. His hands rested on the altar's edge, tracing the grooves where fresh blood had dried. "They are not mine," he murmured. "They are theirs." Erebus tilted his head. "The gods reward the faithful, and none are more faithful than you, my primarch." Faithful. The word had once been his greatest pride. Now it was a chain. Lorgar knew it. He had felt it tighten with every conquered world, every sermon delivered under the watchful eyes of powers beyond mortal comprehension. From the shadows, Cor Farron stepped forward, his armor still spattered with the gore of the day's rites. "We have remade Serenth in the image of truth. This is the beginning of eternity, Lorgar. A galaxy remade in our god's vision." Lorgar finally turned, his amber eyes catching the light. "And when the galaxy is theirs, what will be left of us?" Neither answered. Perhaps they could not. The night deepened, and the final rite of Serenth's consecration began. The entire city gathered in the plaza before the basilica. Thousands knelt in perfect unison, their chants echoing into the black sky. The altar stood upon the basilica steps, flanked by burning braziers that spat sparks into the wind. Lorgar emerged in ceremonial armor, gold chased with deep crimson, the symbols of the pantheon etched into every plate. In his hands he carried the Liber Divinicus, the scripture he had penned with his own hand, the book that had damned him and his legion forever. His voice carried across the plaza without need of amplification. "Children of Serenth," he began, "you have cast off the lies of the false emperor. You have embraced the truth that has been hidden from you for too long. In your suffering, you have been purified. In your faith, you have been remade." The crowd answered with a roar of devotion, their voices mingling into one endless cry. "This night," Lorgar continued, "you are bound to the gods who see you, who hear you, who walk among you in shadow and dream. This night, Serenth dies and is reborn in the light of truth." At his signal, the sacrifices were brought forth. The last of Serenth's imperial priests, bound in chains, they stood defiant even now, their lips moving in prayers to the emperor. Lorgar descended the altar steps until he stood before them. "You will not see the truth in this life," he said quietly, "but in death, you will kneel." The execution was swift. Blades rose and fell, blood soaking the marble until it glistened black under the torchlight. The crowd erupted into frenzied worship, some weeping, others laughing, all swept away in the ecstasy of the moment. When the rites were complete, Lorgar returned to the altar for the final benediction. He opened the Liber Divinicus and began to recite verses, not in High Gothic, but in the language of the warp, each word vibrating in the bones of those who heard it. The air shimmered, the wind stilled, and the veil between realms grew thin. Shadows moved where no light fell, and a whispering chorus filled the plaza. The gods were listening. Lorgar felt them, vast, incomprehensible, and terrible in their attention. They did not speak as mortals did, but their will pressed against his mind, filling him with visions. Worlds burning, stars dying, the galaxy remade in a tapestry of endless war and worship. It was glorious, and it was a prison without end. For a heartbeat, he faltered. His voice caught. In that moment, he saw the Emperor, not in truth, but in memory, standing in the Great Crusade's golden light, speaking of unity, of reason, of a future free from superstition. The vision was a knife in his soul, but the god's presence crushed it away. His voice strengthened. He finished the benediction. The veil closed. The whispers faded. The crowd erupted in rapture, believing they had been blessed, and perhaps they had. But Lorgar knew the truth. This was no blessing. This was the first link in a chain that would bind every living soul to the will of the Pantheon. Later, when the plaza was empty and the fires burned low, Lorgar remained alone at the altar. The stars above seemed cold and distant, their light untouched by gods or men. He whispered into the night, words no follower would ever hear. "If I have damned the galaxy," he said, "then I will bear its weight, to the end." No answer came. Only the wind moved through the streets of the reborn city, carrying with it the scent of incense and blood. And so ended the consecration of Serenth, not with a shout, but with the quiet step of a primarch, walking deeper into the shadow of the gods he had chosen. The last benediction had been spoken. The long war had truly begun. End scene.